Hello and welcome to the Middle East Report. In this edition of the Middle East Report, we'll be looking at the rise of Iran as a regional power in the Middle East, what this means for the Arab world, what this means for Israel, and what this means for the West. We'll be looking at Iran's support for international terrorist organizations such as Hezbollah and Hamas and the threat that they pose to the Middle East. We'll also be looking at Iran's nuclear weapons program and discussing how much of a threat Iran poses to the rest of the world. And to really bring these issues to light, I'm joined today by Dr. Mehrdad Konsari, who is the Secretary General of the Green Wave. Mehrdad, hello and welcome to the program.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me.
It's an absolute pleasure. And you've been very much of a mentor and also a very, very good friend to me over the years, and certainly kept me informed and updated about the situation in Iran and how things are, and also the Middle East as well.
Thank you.
Mehrdad, firstly, you've got quite an amazing story yourself to tell. Certainly your father was very much involved working with the Shah government in Iran. I think you said he was the Deputy Foreign Minister and the Minister of Labour as well. Can you tell us a little bit about your father and the role that your father played with the government of the Shah prior to 1979, and also your role as an former Iranian diplomat?
Of course, you know, my family background is one of at least several generations having served the country in official government capacities, and starting from my great grandfather, going back, let's say, 150 years, to my father, who served the country, had the honor of serving the country for 46 years in different bureaucratic positions, serving as Minister of Labour, as ambassador, and finally as Deputy Foreign Minister of Iran. It was a different era and a different country in many ways, in the sense that the priorities of those days was getting Iran out of the dark ages, introducing it to the 20th century, and helping its people to adopt and to become aware of a new way of reconciling with the world and finding Iran's rightful position in that world. And that spread, across many fields, and a great deal of work was done and a great deal of achievement was made in the course of the 50 years prior to the Islamic Revolution. So, as I said, the priorities of that time was lifting people out of poverty, introducing modern education to the country in a way that did not exist. I remember when I was a boy of around 13 or 14, they showed a documentary. I was going to school in London, and literacy rate in Iran in the early 60s was around 4%. So you can see what a tremendous leap it was to raise that, to provide universal health care, using the wealth of the nation, and finding Iran's rightful position in the international arena, and giving pride to its people to want to achieve more. And of course, the kind of economic prosperity that became possible in those days, when Iran's economic growth matched the kind of growth that countries like Japan were experiencing at the time, and countries like South Korea are doing at this time. So, as I said, that was a golden era in many ways, but of course there was a deficit in the sense that freedom, democracy, the kind of political rights that people want and expect, and rightly expect, obviously lagged behind. And as people became financially better off and became more accustomed, or more, you might say, knowledgeable of what was happening in the developed world, they began wanting to have the same kind of rights and privileges that other people had. And this is when the intellectuals who were educated abroad played a very key role in trying to educate our people. And of course, that was the underlying reasons for why people protested against the kind of government we had at the time. and the Iranian Revolution was supposed to herald a new era where economic prosperity would be matched with political pluralism. But unfortunately, what happened, although it was a grand coalition of various political forces under the leadership of Ayatollah Khomeini, that finally toppled the Shah's regime, but the revolution was hijacked by fundamentalists, and one by one, every liberal democratic group or every even Marxist group or whatever who professed some form of modern ideology were cast aside, and what was left at the end was nothing other than a theocratic dictatorship that has been in charge in the course of the last 32 years.
If we look back at the history prior to the Islamic Revolution of '79, and I remember meeting many Iranians and saying that women's rights were at the fore, equal rights. That it's very much of a liberal country in a sense, in terms of personal freedom, maybe not democratic freedom, but certainly personal freedoms. Can you describe also strategically? Iran had very close relationships with Israel and the West. How did that change so much? Almost did a 180-degree U-turn with the rise of the Ayatollah Khomeini coming to power in '79, and how did he consolidate that power?
Well, first of all, Ayatollah Khomeini came from a different school of mind. His ideology and his personal doctrine of Velayat al-Faqih, which means in English the guardianship of the clerics, is based on the fact that no single individual in society is capable of making political decisions by themselves and are thus considered as minors. And therefore they should delegate that right of political decision-making to the cleric, to the clergyman, who will exercise that on their behalf because they are the ones who are only knowledgeable about Islamic laws and matters relating to the Almighty. Now, if you accept this preface, you are denying the concept of popular sovereignty on which all modern democracies are based. People object to, let's say, the apartheid system in South Africa, or what existed, let's say, before in Zimbabwe or Rhodesia, where you had, let's say, a minority governments of 400,000 or 600,000 against a couple of million in Zimbabwe and about 5 million whites and 20 million blacks in South Africa. In Iran, the system set up by Ayatollah Khomeini, which, according to the way they stage managed everything, was popularly approved by the Iranian nation in a referendum, essentially gives 200 or 300,000 people the right to decide for 70 million people. So the proportions are far worse than anything that people in the West are used to knowing, as because they existed, let's say, in a place like South Africa or Rhodesia before. Now, to actually implement such a concept, you have to get rid by force of anyone who challenges that. And that is exactly what Khomeini did once he assumed power. He came up, he incorporated his concept and made it the central theme of the Iranian national constitution. And anybody who deviated from that was either murdered or cast aside or imprisoned or, essentially forced into exile. Any election that has been held in Iran since the incorporation of this new constitution, anybody participating as a candidate has to first and foremost acknowledge this constitution and this provision as being in line with his thoughts and ideologies. So essentially that eliminates anybody who has a wider view of democracy. And in order to ensure that nobody jumps these hurdles, they set up a council which essentially vets people. And if they consider you not to be fully, you might say, on board with these dictates, you cannot participate in any election. So you can imagine that any election that has been held since 1979-80, and they've held more than, at least 20, 25 different elections, are nothing but bogus showcases, in the sense that only people vetted by themselves and who accept and acknowledge the provisions of the Constitution which only they accept can participate. So this is even worse than the kind of Soviet type elections that we had in the times of the USSR. So it means nothing. But they have been able to do this by force, as I said, and they were helped in this by the start of the Iran-Iraq war, which essentially drew the attention of the nation away from most political issues and concentrated on the defense of the realm, something that all Iranians were unified in wanting to resist Iraqi aggression, and that gave them the time they needed in order to consolidate their position and to essentially extract a huge price from the Iranian nation by torturing, murdering, imprisoning people in order to ensure that their rule can survive.
That's extremely interesting. Certainly informed me on this one. But also, Iran developed, certainly through its clerics, the whole concept of the modern-day suicide bomb. Wasn't it the case where they encouraged children to walk across the landmines during the war between Iran and Iraq?
There were reports that young people were deceived into taking risks that you would never subject anyone to. In the most extreme cases of warfare, and there were many casualties. And in fact, this kind of indoctrination, which was used effectively by the Islamic government during the initial phases of the Iran-Iraq war, was a main instrument in the hands of the regime in trying to intimidate the Iraqis, as well as intimidating the Iranian people. But like all things, the novelty wears off and people catch on. And once the big lie is discovered, then the number of volunteers subside. So whereas it was a good propaganda tool for a while, by the end of the war it had lost all currency. And today, people who served in the Iran-Iraq war, people who sacrificed a great deal during that terrible period of hardship for our people, have acknowledged and are aware that their trust and faith in the system that was introduced to them in the name of their religion, Islam, had betrayed them, had taken advantage of them. And whereas they still remain strong Muslims and, fully committed to their faith, they have become aware that the people who are governing them in the name of religion have very little respect for the tenets of the faith and have only abused them.
Yeah. And as we look back at 1982, Iran wanted to export the Islamic Revolution. I think you said it earlier, the Valiat al-Faqih, and established Hezbollah in southern Lebanon and established international terror networks throughout the world. Why does Iran support and sponsor international terrorism, and what does the Iranian regime have to gain from such an aggressive foreign policy?
Well, you have to put all of these things into some kind of a perspective. The way that I look at it and the way that I have analyzed this in my mind is the fact that the Islamic Revolution came on the back of huge popularity. When the revolution succeeded, the revolution was strong, Khomeini was popular, the new regime had a mandate. But by 1982, once the war had started, once the Iraqis had been evicted from Iran, and there was no reason for Iran to continue the war, especially since many Arab countries were willing to give Iran a great deal of reparation in order for Iran to stop and cease hostilities. And the failure of the Islamic regime to tackle any of Iran's massive internal problems, beginning with the economy and the social situation, education, health, you name it, all these great areas which determine the fate of any government in any modern democracy or in any modern setup. Their failure in those areas had resulted in a tremendous letdown, and people had begun to question the validity of the capability of these people to govern a complex country like Iran. So the revolution had started becoming unpopular. What the regime was afraid of was the fact that if it became unpopular, then the foreign governments, like the United States, Western governments with embassies in Tehran or potential embassies in Iran, would be able to maneuver or do things inside Iran that would be to their, which would not be advantageous to them and could help different groups in different ways. So whereas up to that time, talk of exporting the revolution, which had been prevalent from the very first day of the revolution, had been limited mainly to the realm of propaganda, after it became apparent that the revolution was going downhill and there was no way that they could do anything to make it popular again, the main strategy for the survival of the regime became one of trying to engage opponents outside, in arenas outside Iran. So for the first time you see them setting up Hezbollah, let's say in Lebanon, trying to divert attention away from Iran itself and their own weaknesses within Iran by engaging foreign powers in places like Lebanon. Later that expanded to, let's say, Palestine, where Hamas was helped. One of the main slogans was, which the regime used to use, is that we are going to convert stone-throwing people into missile-throwing people. And this is exactly what they did. People who used to throw stone at Israeli troops began firing missiles at Israeli settlements. Or later they started supporting Shiite, you might say, surrogates in Iraq to cause trouble for the Americans and the British. Many British casualties suffered in Iraq are due to Iranian roadside bombs, made available to elements inside Iraq. I think many people within the British Army have acknowledged that on a number of times. Or the American, let's say, military in Afghanistan have done the same, where the Iranians have also tried to play a similar role in Afghanistan, despite the fact that they hate the Taliban perhaps more than anybody else. And, of course, now they try to spread their wings to Latin America, or, let's say, Yemen, or new arenas such as Bahrain or Egypt. The entire strategy is based on the fact that if we can keep the Westerners occupied in other arenas, they do not have an opportunity to interfere or to do anything against us inside Iran. And it's here that we should survive. And that is why what the King of Saudi Arabia had sort of divulged in the WikiLeaks about cutting the head of the snake is so relevant, because everything that you see in the region, all the turmoil in the region, potential trouble in remote areas from the Middle East, like Latin America, are all sponsored and planned in Iran. So if you can change the situation in Iran, you automatically bring about a different scenario in all these places.
You talked about there the growth of Iran's sphere of influence, and it's become to light that Iran's become heavily involved in Africa. We had arms shipments seized in Nigeria, heavily involved in South America, with the drug cartels and drug smuggling, and also weapons smuggling as well, a whole load of issues, setting up paramilitary training camps as well. Why is Iran doing this? Is this one way to engage the third world in a power struggle against the United States by setting up an alternative influence or alternative government that would challenge the United States at every corner? Or is it to put the Iranian government under pressure by also having, for example, Shihab-3 missiles being deployed in Venezuela?
I think it's a combination of all these factors. It is a regime that is intrinsically anti-Western and feeds off its anti-American stance. Anti-Americanism is part and parcel of the regime's situation. It needs that, it feeds on that. But apart from the fact of trying to make trouble for the United States wherever it can, whether it's in Latin America or in Iraq or Afghanistan or in Bahrain or in Egypt or anywhere else, I think that based on my analysis, the most important objective of the regime is to protect itself. This is an offensive move made for strategic, defensive, aspirations. They know that so long as I mentioned before, so long as elements capable of inflicting damage on them are engaged in arenas away from them, then they're safe. Now, the most important question that comes to is, how come all these clever Western countries have not figured this out? I think that they are beginning to figure this out now. And the emphasis were to shift from trying to engage Iran, let's say, in southern Lebanon, by engaging Iran in a different way, by helping elements who want to engage the regime inside Iran, then I think the proposition would change. Then I think you would see a completely different attitude and a different reflex from the Iranian system.
And you talked about the regime, the Iranian regime, wanting to firstly preserve their own government and their own regime. Is there not a danger now that this is probably one of the main reasons why Iran is wanting to acquire nuclear weapons? And according to recent intelligence reports that have been disclosed to the media, that Iran is very, very close to developing nuclear weapons. Isn't this whole issue of Iran acquiring nuclear weapons one of the greatest foreign policy challenges of today? And that if Iran continues its nuclear weapons program, that will only lead to a proliferation of nuclear weapons in the Middle East, probably creating the most volatile and most dangerous region in the world, followed by the fact that Iran could then use its proxy terrorist organizations and give them this nuclear material, and that they could plant a nuclear bomb somewhere in New York or in London or Paris and cause a major problem. What can the United States and the EU and Britain do to prevent Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons?
Well, I think that the United States and the 5+1 group at the UN Security Council are doing whatever they can at this stage to try to persuade the Iranian government to exercise different options and not to go along this path, which, of course, the Iranian government denies it is going. But I think there is no doubt in my mind anyway that the Iranian regime wants to acquire nuclear weapons. And I don't think that, what one can speculate that a nuclear Iran would be capable of doing a whole series of bad things. But short of even that, the worst thing that can happen were Iran to become nuclear is that it would perpetuate the continuation of a regime that is intrinsically bad for the Iranian people. Now, Iranian people are a very proud people, and they don't like to be told by the outside world that they cannot have this or that. But I think that under the right sort of circumstances, if you had a free and democratic government in Iran that would educate the Iranian people as to the pros and cons of, pursuing a nuclear path, that the majority of Iranians could be persuaded that there is no advantage security-wise, financially, from economically, environmentally, for Iran to want to go along this route. And that's why debate regarding all these key issues, the national security aspects, foreign policy aspects, economic aspects, social aspects, environmental aspects of a nuclear program has been deliberately, silenced within Iran so that the regime can do whatever it likes. But I think that this is definitely a threat. It is a threat because this is a very dangerous regime. If you had a sane regime and it had nuclear weapons, it would be dangerous, but one could justify and say that there are people who are not fanatics, they know what they're doing, this is a modern day, weapon, and like many responsible governments in other places, that they would behave in those fashions. But the record of the Islamic regime is a different one. The threat it has made to the existence of the State of Israel, whereas no one really believes that they would engage in any kind of a nuclear, confrontation with anybody. But the fact is that you don't want them to be, to continue governing Iran solely on the basis that they can intimidate the entire world and the Iranian people because they have nuclear weapons.
The next issue, Mehrdad, I want to raise really, which very much ties into Iran's nuclear weapons program, and that is the propaganda tool of the Iranian regime, and in preparing their people for the return of the Mahdi, or the 12th Imam, the Shia Messiah. And we have a clip to go to now which highlights what the Iranian government is doing in preparing their security forces for the return of the Mahdi.
سلام بر مهدی او که اهل آسمان و زمین به او عشق می‌ورزند.
سلام بر زمین سازان ظهور و منتظران طلوع خورشید.
قرن‌هاست که جهان بشریت چشم انتظار آمدن مردی است که تمام ادیان الهی آمدنش را بشارت دادند.
او که آینه تمام نمای جمال الهی، انسان کامل و وارث تمام انبیا از آدم تا خاتم است.
و جهان را پر از عدل و داد خواهد کرد، آن گونه که از ظلم و جور پر شده بود.
اما سوالی که از ابتدا برای مردم هر دوره مطرح بوده این است که آیا ظهور در دوران آنها رخ خواهد داد؟
آیا آنها ظهور را خواهند دید؟
قائم قیام نمی کند مگر پس از وحشت شدید، زلزله ها و فتنه های فراگیر. پست‌ترین مردم زمامداران آنها می شوند.
زنان کشف حجاب می کنند و زیورهای خود را آشکار می سازند.
قومی از مشرق قیام می کنند و زمین را برای حکومت مهدی آماده می سازند.
رایحه ظهور موعود دل شیفتگان حق را بیتاب کرده و آنان را به صحنه حضور کشانده.
فوکویاما یک ماه پس از حادثه 11 سپتامبر در مصاحبه‌ای با روزنامه گاردین تأکید کرد که اسلام تنها نظام فرهنگی است که مدرنیته غربی را تهدید می‌کند. او تصریح کرد که آمریکا می‌تواند برای شکستن مقاومت کشورهای اسلامی در برابر مدرنیته از توان نظامی خود استفاده کند. آمریکا پس از 11 سپتامبر پروژه اسلام هراسی را رسما کلید زد. آمریکا با همپیمانی 40 کشور حمله به جهان اسلام را آغاز کرد و در طی چند سال صدها هزار تن بمب بر سر مردم کشورهای مختلف مسلمان فرو ریخت. علت تمرکز اشغالگران بر مناطق مذهبی عراق و مسجد صحنه و کوفه و بازجویی از مردم به دنبال افرادی با اسامی خاص چه بود؟ عده‌ای اعتقاد دارند این تهاجم همه‌جانبه ارتباط مستقیم با مباحث آخرالزمانی و ظهور داشت. زمانی که عرب‌ها زمام امور خود را از نفوذ دیگران رها ساخته و عزم جدی آنان دوباره تجدید شود، آنگاه سرزمین فلسطین به دست آنها فتح خواهد شد و عرب‌ها پیروز و متحد خواهند گردید و نیروهای کمکی از سرزمین عراق به آنان خواهند رسید که بر روی پرچم‌هایشان نوشته شده است القوة.
حمله به لبنان کردن، اشتباه کردن. حمله به غزه کردن، اشتباه کردن. حمله به این کشتی‌ها کردن، اشتباه کردن. این اشتباه‌ها یکی پس از دیگری نشان دهنده این است که رژیم غاصب صهیونیستی به نهایت قطعی خود، یعنی سرنگون شدن و ساقط شدن در دره نیستی، داره قدم به قدم نزدیک میشه.
في هدأة عينيك نطلب نصرا ويسابقنا الشوق إليك.
Welcome back to the Middle East Report. Meredad, what do you make of that video and what was the purpose behind it?
Well, you know, I mean, I have to say that on the one hand, there are people, you know, devout Muslims who believe, you know, that the Mahdi is something that is important as far as their religious beliefs are concerned, and it is legend that one day he will return, and far be it from me in wanting to question people's religious beliefs or, their preferences. I, as a Iranian politician, as somebody who looks at the Iranian scene and tries to understand as to why the regime should want to air something like this, you know, which has nothing to do with reality in the sense that we understand it and must remain within the private domains of people's religious beliefs, can only come up with one conclusion. Mr. Ahmadinejad is engaged in a political struggle with the supreme leader at this time. Having already polarized the Iranian political scene, having essentially gotten rid of all the reformist elements in the aftermath of the 2009 presidential elections, the internal battle right now is concentrated between conservative elements supportive of him and his faction and those of the supreme leader. By releasing a tape concerning the imminent return of the Mahdi, this, you know, sort of this glorified fictitious figure that's supposed to return when the world ends, essentially, and saying that this is imminent and that his government, the propaganda of his government is that his government is the government of the Mahdi, and he is waiting for the return of the Mahdi, there is a political message there that if my government is that of the Mahdi, and if we are working directly with the Mahdi, then we don't need a supreme leader. And therefore, the supreme leader's position and his representation or his alleged situation as the representative of God on earth is redundant because we are dealing with the main person. And that is to try to give some sort of religious credibility to the kind of political positioning that he wants to use and benefit from in his battle to gain complete control of the Iranian political situation.
So just going on and just analysing what you're saying there, Meredad, is there not a great danger then that he's actually using this as a power play, really, to outplay and outmaneuver the supreme leader of Iran? So when President Ahmadinejad talks about wiping Israel off the face of the earth and wanting nuclear weapons in order to do that, do we take him at his word, or do we actually believe, as many Middle Eastern analysts do, who are very concerned that he's fueled by this vision that he is the one that's going to prepare the return of the Mahdi, and that he is the one that's going to usher him in, so therefore he has to create almost an Armageddon-style nuclear scenario in order for him to return? Does he truly believe that, or is he using this for power play?
Well, it's very difficult, to provide an exact response to this question, because nobody knows what's going on inside his head. But so far, he has not acted irrationally in the sense that from nowhere he has become the president of Iran. Now, I think what he's trying to do is to try to pursue populist policies and to try to deceive people. He knows that in the Arab world, the Arab street is frustrated because of the impotence of Arab leaders in combating Israel. After 3 major wars which Arab countries have lost, the theme has become negotiation, talk, which has not produced the kind of results that Arab street wanted. So he talks about wiping Israel off the map of the world. He knows that this is just a populist assertion doesn't mean anything, but it gains popularity for him.
Yeah.
Making reference to the Mahdi is again another populist ploy. People have religious belief. We, as opponents of the Islamic regime and this kind of theocratic dictatorship, are not against Islam. We want to privatize religion. People are entitled to have their beliefs and practice their beliefs, whatever their beliefs are. But to use it in the fashion that he has is trying to use it in a populist way to provide certain notions that are very dear to many ordinary citizens who are not involved in everyday politics. So it's a very cynical ploy. All of these things, even if if they're not intended to make war against Israel or to do something sinister within Iran, they are all aimed at projecting him as some sort of a hero figure, both to ordinary, uneducated, you might say, the most simple class of people within the country, and to the Arab street outside who are oblivious of the problems that he faces within the country himself.
So, do you believe that the Iranian regime is stepping up its war against Israel by its direct support for Hezbollah and Hamas? And according to a recent statement by the US Secretary of Defense, Robert Gates, says that Hezbollah is now in possession of chemical and biological weapons, and that Hezbollah has 50,000 missiles targeted Israel, supplied by the Iranian regime. Are we heading for a new war in the Middle East? And is Iran the instigator of this war?
I think that Iran definitely wants to use its surrogates like Hezbollah, like Hamas up to a lesser extent, in as much as it can. its alliance with Syria over the years has been a fruitful one in the sense that Syria has served as a conduit for Iranian supplying of the Hezbollah movement. And of course, the question is that if the Iranian regime should remain intact, there is always a danger of another Middle Eastern war between Israel and Hezbollah, in essence to finish off what was not finished off in 2006. And obviously Hezbollah has been resupplied, Hezbollah has equipment that it can use and so on and so forth, which can inflict damage. So it will be a very dangerous war that could conceivably come up. But were the situation to change within Iran, then the fact that Hezbollah has all these missiles does not necessarily mean that another war situation will necessarily arise, because the new government in Iran would force Hezbollah to amalgamate itself within the armed forces of Lebanon and to change the entire disposition of Hezbollah, not relinquishing, you might say, support for the Shiites in Lebanon or the rightful place that they must have within Lebanese society, but redirecting them in a different way so that they do not engage in confrontation and war. Confrontation and war is very possible with the likes of Ahmadinejad, and it's very improbable in case of a regime change in Iran.
But Meredith, can you explain to us really the level of hatred that's targeted at Israel, that's targeted at the Jewish people, and the anti-Semitism that comes from the regime, almost threatening Israel with another Holocaust and another annihilation? I mean, President Ahmadinejad was famous for denying the Holocaust. He's had conferences where he's saying a world without America and a world without Zionism. Where does this fundamental hatred of Israel and the Jewish people come from?
Well, I think it comes from people with a bigoted background. This is not a feeling that is universally shared in Iran. But if you are sort of focused on a fundamentalist constituency, that fundamentalist constituency can be anywhere, and it will come out with the same kind of rhetoric, whether it's in Northern Ireland, whether it's in some other place, or Israel, within Israel, among some of the, you might say, the smaller Jewish communities, religious communities who accept their own way of thinking and nobody else's. Now, as I mentioned to you earlier, you have a situation in Iran where essentially 200,000 clerics in theory are governing the fate of 70 million Iranians. Now let me make one other extra point here. Of that 200,000 clerics, at most 10% subscribe to the kind of ideology, religious ideology, professed by the state. So you're talking about a small minority within a larger, huge minority determining the fate of the country and making statements on behalf of its people, which is totally, out of context and out of position with the true feelings and sentiments of the Iranian people, who bear no animosity towards the people of Israel, and whose political leaders, by and large, accept Israel as a political reality. All of us would like to see Israel exist as a state. At the same time, we would like them to be far more generous in their behavior towards the Palestinians and help resolve that issue. But those issues are issues that you can discuss, amongst friends and amongst people with whom you have dialogue. These are not issues to separate Iran from Israel in the future, just as they did not separate Iran from Israel in the past.
But there can be no peace process if the Iranians are directly involved in supporting Hamas, they're supporting Hezbollah, they're supporting to try and remove President Abbas from power and then disrupting the peace process anyway. Plus also the regional power plays that are going on within the region itself, which really leads me on to the next question. What was your assessment of President Obama's foreign policy in relations to Iran? He came in as a president saying he wanted constructive dialogue and constructive relations with Iran, and as we've witnessed, really, it seems that his whole Middle Eastern foreign policy is now in tatters. What was your response to President Obama's foreign policy towards Iran, and is he going in the wrong direction?
Well, let me say just prior to addressing this that I think that the fact that Hamas and Fatah were able to reach some kind of a reconciliation was not good news for the Iranians. This is not what they wanted. And obviously, the Iranians have obstructed the peace process deliberately since Camp David in 2000. And they will continue to do that because they feed off of that dissension. They feed by dividing the Palestinian community and keeping this warlike rhetoric going. This is what keeps them in power back in Iran. They shed nothing other than crocodile tears for the people of Palestine. They do not have the welfare of the people of Palestine in mind. There's a lot of talk and rhetoric and propaganda, but in reality, they have done everything to help undermine any kind of situation that can, in the long term, help lift the people of Palestine out of their present problems. But coming back to President Obama, I think he's had a serious education in the last couple of years. He came to power trying to do the exact opposite of whatever George Bush was saying or doing, and trying to establish constructive dialogue in face of, more than, let's say, 30 years, almost 30 years of U.S. experience with the Islamic regime was something that was totally unrealistic. He had this delusion that with his prestige or something that he could force the Iranian regime to change its spots and behave in a different fashion. I think that has gone, and I think that as we speak now, there is no illusion on his part that the Islamic regime is what it is and that it is difficult for the United States to reach any kind of a meaningful accommodation with them so long as they want to continue pursuing the same policies. I think that their position against Iran will become harder because the Iranians are going to become more intransigent. And as the minority government in Iran becomes even more minor, they will become more radical. And the more radical become, they have no choice. The United States will have no choice but to try to become tougher itself by imposing more sanction and hardening its position as we go along.
And also witnessing the historic events that we've seen this year. We've seen the rise of the Arab Spring, we've seen the government in Tunisia disposed, and also in Egypt with the fall of President Mubarak. How are the Iranians exploiting this situation? Because it seems that the regimes that have gone, for example, Mubarak's regime in Egypt is very much pro-Western, supported the current peace treaty with Israel. And you also have Bahrain, which is also a strong defender of the West. Is Iran exploiting the Arab Spring in order to gain strategic advantages within
Iran
the Arab
is trying
world?
to exploit the Arab Spring, if you will, only out of fear, because they're afraid that the blowbacks will come and get them. But where Iran is in a position of advantage is that where change has occurred in Tunisia and Egypt is where the West has had some kind of a leverage over the governments and over the army and the situation there. In Syria and Libya, as you see, it's been a much more difficult affair. But the propaganda and the message of the Arab people has resonated in Iran, and I am sure that the blowbacks from it will effectively alter the situation and will result in the same kind of, end game as we shall be witnessing in Libya and Syria before too long.
And Cyrus the Great, according to my notes, has been described as the father of the Iranian people. who was famous for liberating the Jews in Babylon and allowing them to return to Jerusalem to rebuild the temple. He was also established the first charter of human rights, liberating the people under the oppression of the Babylonians. Is there hope that Iran could again be a force for good in the world and follow in the footsteps of Cyrus the Great?
Well, Simon, this is something that people like myself live for. It is the legacy of Cyrus that we want to bring back to our country and to help our people, to help the future of our country based on something of that nature, as opposed to the legacy which has been brought to us by Khomeini in the last 32 years, which must be consigned to the dustbin of history.
What is the chance? I mean, you head up the Green Wave movement, and we saw those incredible demonstrations after the 2009 presidential elections. What hope is there for the Iranian people then to overthrow this only described as barbaric, evil regime in Iran and become a force for good in the nations once again?
I think the majority of Iranian people understand that they have no future with this regime. The future generation of Iranians are at risk because of the policies of this regime. And I think the Iranian people are responsible enough, and with proper leadership, at the right time, they will behave in a way that will secure the kind of future that they deserve and that they want, and create a situation whereby the region can be converted from a source of instability to a source of stability and hope for world peace in general, and for regional stability as a whole.
Really, just in just 1 minute, because we're virtually down to the end of the program, what would a peace treaty between Israel and Iran mean for the Middle East? And that's my hope.
Well, I think that Iran, Turkey, and Israel are the three major non-Arab countries in the region. Relationship between Turkey and Israel have been strained, but they are existing. There is dialogue. There should be a similar kind of arrangement and relationship between Iran and Israel, and any problems that there are should be discussed bilaterally. Dialogue should exist, and the option of war and rhetoric of that nature should be cast aside, and that is what will happen.
Yeah. Dr. Mehrdad Ansari, I just want to thank you very much for joining me today on the Middle East Report. Thank you for your excellent analysis, and certainly educated me here, and I'm sure many of our viewers will now be more informed on what's happening in Iran. So I just want to thank you very much for watching the Middle East Report today, focusing on Iran, and let's hope that the Iranian people can really grasp the freedoms that they cherish in order that there can be peace and stability in the Middle East, and maybe we see a new order in the Middle East. So thank you for watching the Middle East Report, and we're going to leave with this song that really what is really about the Iranian people against the suppression that they're facing from their government. So thank you for watching, and goodbye.
Maybe someday you will find me with the shackles off my hands. It will be 'cause I've surrendered. Then I'm never looking back. Maybe someday it's forever, and we all can live this way. My heart will just grow stronger in the knowing that we'll pave the way. This day.
President Ahmadinejad and his unelected puppeteer, Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, do not represent the people of Iran.
Maybe we will walk in freedom. After all is said and done, in the wake of all that's happened, I still struggle for the strength to be the one sadness and disgrace, and I will triumph this day. This day, searching for a reason. I've been looking for the proof. I've learned that I can be stronger with the help of those who cherish the truth. And as I look into your eyes, the difference between you and I is hardly worth the price we all have paid. But this time I'm not backing down. I came in peace, but I'll stand my ground. We've lost too much to wait another day. So we will rise up and stand. We will carry these banners in our hands. We will march across these torn and tattered lands. We will stare into the face of all the sadness and disgrace, and we will stare into the face of all the sadness and disgrace, and we will triumph this day.